My name is Fatin Alhadi.
And I'm Sarah Tannenbaum.
And we are students at MSPP.
Both in the CFAR concentration, which is the concentration on children and families of adversity and resilience.
We are creating this video as part of a directed study that we designed with the instruction of Dr. Jodie Kliman. What you'll be watching is a training video of sorts that we've kind of put together.
For students, for faculty, and just to sort of encourage and invite more challenging conversations or deeper conversations on multiculturalism and social justice.
As students at MSPP, we have had a number of experiences where these conversations have kind of come up. It didn't feel like any of us were really prepared or knew how to really have this conversation.
A few things happen. People might get really emotional to the point of getting angry, or not really being able to engage because of the overwhelming affect. People don't even know why. Sometimes they're getting emotional, but they do.
We found ourselves in situations where I felt like, wait a minute, what am I supposed to say right now? Should I say something? What do I say? How do I say it? There are times when we found ourselves really upset and couldn't have a productive conversation. MSPP is not as an exception. I think we experience that in a lot of sites and different institutions. Well, we wanted to learn too how to kind of facilitate these difficult conversations, and so we thought it might be helpful for others as well.
As fourth years in the Psy.D program at this point in our training, we should be more equipped to have these conversations, but that also sort of as students and emerging professionals, it's kind of a hard place to have these conversations because we're not in positions of power. So we wanted to sort of ask at this stage in our professional development, how can we engage in these conversations and how can we continue to engage in them as we develop throughout our careers and invite others to engage in them with us.
After we did these interviews with the facilitators in the field who we will introduce, what we did was kind of go through so we can see what are important things that emerged, what are important things for professionals to know when they are trying to facilitate these kinds of conversations, or if they kind of come up as a surprise, how can we handle it? And then also, these are tools that we can use in the future, but also as trainees and graduate students now. We interviewed Ms. Shani Dowd.
We also interviewed Dr. Gonzalo Bacigalupe
and Dr. David Trimble.
And we interviewed Dr. Rick Pinderhughes.
The first question that we asked is, what in their early life has kind of led them to this work? We found that our experiences kind of influence the direction we go in or the work that we do. And it also comes from kind of our CFAR approach, wanting to understand how early life experience kind of influences our choices later on.
I sort of feel like my whole early life set me up for this work. I grew up a military brat, so I was an outsider in most of the communities that I lived in or around or near. I also grew up in a part of the country where there were a lot of remnants of slavery, and yet I found that whenever I would ask, gee, what's that? I got the same answer, hush child. There was this silence. I knew that silence meant something, but I was a young child and I couldn't put it together, but I knew there was something not right about that. And then when I was 9, we were posted to Germany. So 10 years after the end of World War II, I'm living in Bavaria, which was the heartland of the Nazi Party, and being I would say, curious child. I wanted to know if the German adults I was meeting ever knew a Nazi. I knew better than to ask them if they ever were a Nazi. And every single German I asked said, oh no, I never met any of them. So I knew here was this lie. And I knew these two things were connected. Silence around the Holocaust, silence around slavery. But from that very early age, I was very, very aware of the role of silence and social injustice, that there was something very powerful about the adults being unwilling to name it. When I came back from Germany, I was 12, and I was already radicalized. I was like, not being silent. But I'm very clear looking back that those experiences were absolutely formative and catapulting me into work around multiculturalism and social justice.
I immigrated from Chile 26 years ago, and so before coming here, I really did not think in terms of multiculturalism per se. Throughout my career at the university and even during high school, I was always involved in what would be called social justice activist work. The meaning of social justice was very much entrenched in my own psyche. From as a child, actually, very early on, I was very involved in politics. So I did not go to university to learn about social justice. I was very much involved. I was part of my work against the dictatorship. Now coming here to the U.S., to which I just came first to study, I sort of learned as the years progress about being a person of color. You know, I came from Chile, where even though I did not come from a rich family or anything like that, typical middle class professional parents, I did not perceive myself as being part of the stigmatized group until it took me some years here to be socialized in the notion of being someone who was seen as less than.
All throughout my childhood, there were many different experiences. My father was a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, and he had a community model, so he was very insistent on both treating as well as working with hospitals and community-based clinics. And my mother is a social worker. They both made a lot of contributions in the field. There was a justice lens already, and I recall them many times working with the community, empowering from within. They were very involved with Freedom House. I remember as a really young person tagging along and going there while they had their meetings. I still have these strong images of being at the March on Washington and having my own plaque. You know, I remember being really excited about that. Also recall many experiences where I witnessed my parents advocating in some way for either somebody in the family or themselves. Very clearly energetic, passionate. I believe the word was angry. Doing it in a way where people had to stop and listen. I think every single person in my family has been working in a field where there's something around social justice or equity or community health.
So my parents, my father was a descendant of many generations of Methodist ministers, but he was also a socialist, a Trotskyite socialist. And my mother came from generations of sort of civically minded Yankees, including an editor of the New York Times, who was my great-grandfather. So it's a combination of sort of a Christian pastoral sensibility, a socialist, social justice sensibility, a civic responsibility. All of those were part of my parents' heritage. And I grew up during the McCarthy era, so my parents didn't talk about their politics except very indirectly. Their cover story was that they didn't teach us about their political views because we just reject them as adults. I think it was because of the McCarthy era, and they didn't want us to be saying things in school that would lead to trouble in the family. But I always had that background sense of it. And my parents taught me about race in the sense of letting me know about the social injustice, mostly in the South, although they said it was prejudice in the North. But it was a very paradoxical kind of instruction because they also taught a sort of colorblindness sense of race. And the few times that they had us around large numbers of African American people, I felt a discomfort that I couldn't talk about because the sort of colorblindness ideology. And I grew up in an almost exclusively white community. The only group that they had fewer of than African Americans was Jews. So got into activism sort of knowing that it was my heritage, even though it wasn't talked about that much. But I remained really uneasy about race because I couldn't put together colorblindness with the fact that I had strong reactions of difference whenever I was around African Americans, which wasn't often because they were like zero African American families. And I would take the bus into New York, and we would come through Englewood, New Jersey, which has a reasonably sized African American community. African Americans would get on the bus. I would feel a discomfort. I didn't have a language for it. So then the March on Washington came in 1963, and I got on a bus with a bunch of people from Englewood and went down to New Jersey. So I was with a group of African Americans in solidarity where race was like at the forefront, and race was acknowledged as a difference. And that was a very important time for me. So I have sort of a complex sensibility about race. And my politics shifted from sort of civic responsibility on my mother's side more toward my father's socialism.
Through our interviews, what we found was that what is really important in this work and being able to have these conversations and to facilitate them, you really have to actively and continuously self-examine and self-reflect, and you have to know who you are and where you came from and what that means in the world.
So we'll tell you a little bit about who we are and where we each came from. I am a white Jewish American woman. I grew up in New York City, and I've lived in Boston for the past 8 years. I grew up in an upper middle class family where I was sort of taught that I needed to be socially responsible for people who had less than me, but it was sort of done still in a sort of us versus them kind of way. It's not kind of, getting into the work or being exposed to those poor people or going to spend time in those communities. I had sort of a very academic or intellectual introduction to multiculturalism and social justice. It's always been important to me, but over my graduate training in particular, I felt really that I need to kind of take the intellectual piece away a little bit and just get some exposure to people really different than myself.
So I am a straight woman. I am the only daughter of 2 immigrants. My parents both immigrated here. My father is Indonesian, my mother is Singaporean, so Southeast Asian background. I grew up in a traditional Muslim family, very involved and connected to my Muslim community. I grew up in a very, very middle class family. My parents both have college educations. My dad has with a graduate degree. I don't know in my early life if I really consciously thought about multiculturalism and social justice. I think a lot of personal experiences that I had made me think about things in terms of difference, whether it's culture, race, religion, socioeconomic status, but I didn't really have the language to really understand the larger implications of my experiences. And then as I kind of got older, I started to learn the language from other people. I started to see that other people had similar experiences or feelings, and that's when I really started to explore, what does social justice mean? What does multiculturalism mean? I don't know that even in my immediate family, my parents didn't grow up here. I don't know that we've even had a conversation about diversity or social justice. It just was.
We come from very different backgrounds, but I think that's part of why we've become really good friends and why we've been able to do this work together.
So one thing that we were interested in is getting, looking at the bigger picture of where the field has gone as far as training people in multiculturalism and social justice. So we asked what their training looked like when they were in graduate school, and what they felt was lacking, to kind of give us a sense of where the field was, where it is now, where does it have room to grow.
When I was in graduate school, I felt like there was a big chunk of who I was that was like invisible. But there really wasn't training in cultural sensitivity or responsiveness. It was sort of like the implicit model is that what's normal is what's white, middle class, male for that matter. It was a male profession. So what was lacking was there was no awareness of race, gender, sexual orientation, social justice, except in the most rarefied way.
There was no training when I was coming up. There really wasn't even much of a framework of social justice. I learned from older activists. There were people in the field, like one of the people I learned enormous amounts from was Saul Alinsky, even though I never met him. I read everything the man wrote and applied it as best I could to what I was trying to work on. So that was how I got my education around social activism, around social justice, around multiculturalism.
There has been a course from time to time that I wouldn't say really spoke to restorative or social justice. It really spoke to your classic diversity class. It was reading books like Black Families in Therapy, Native Americans in Therapy, Latinos in Therapy. So at the time, I mean, it was important stuff, and this is where we were.
During my Ph.D, I had courses that some were very experiential around cross-cultural counseling, and my family therapy program was very much paying attention to issues of race and ethnicity and culture. My training per se came after. It was more like in the postdoc phase when I was a professor, and when I finally realized that I was not seen as a valid individual. I mean, when I, at my first faculty position, I left it because I felt very unsupported, not validated, not legitimate, not heard. And I started to participate from the cultural conferences, actually. And I tried to go to, when I went to APA, I would go to Sue's presentations, and I would really immerse myself in the multicultural counseling literature and thinking.
Certainly at CMTP, the dominant understanding of cultural competence is that you understand yourself as a cultural being. What I found is there's nothing in cultural competence training that isn't good training for clinical practice.
I'm wondering if when people watch this video, if they're gonna say what's wrong with learning about Native Americans in therapy or African Americans in therapy, and if they're gonna sort of say that makes sense, what would we need to do differently? It kind of takes this point of view of let's look at them, let's look at those people, and try to learn what we can about them.
Yeah.
So it's a really othering kind of stance.
Learning about Black families in therapy, Latino families in therapy kind of puts everyone in a box.
So one of the things that really struck me is that I think our experiences in graduate school really sort of brought us to this project and made us feel like we need to be doing more. But that hearing some of the people who have been trained before us, it also makes me recognize how far we have come. For some people to have never been exposed to this thinking, what we're looking for is exposure at a deeper level, or a level that's more embedded into everything that we do.
Just listening to the interviews, we can kind of see the progression of where training has gone, or where the field has gone as far as putting importance on multiculturalism and social justice. And so it is it's striking to hear that there are people who were never trained in this. At least we get exposure and we do get training, and it's interesting to see that and then to look forward and see where it is that maybe we need to grow. What we found to be really interesting throughout the interviews was that the theme of immersion or experiential learning came up throughout all the interviews, and that's not something that we had explicitly asked about or really referred to, but something that they all talked about, whether it was in the way of experiential learning as part of training or talking about their own immersion experiences.
I think one way is by immersion. The biggest challenge is going into the field with no experience and only book learning. Because I think it's hard when you're just reading it in books to get a sense of what it looks like in real life. It's sort of if you're training to be a clinician, it helps to see some patients.
It's very hard to do social justice, multicultural, just by learning about it. You have to do. It's very experiential, and it works at the personal, interpersonal, and social community. Larger. I mean, it has this, and it cannot be separated. It's not just a psychological thing. It's not just a relational thing. It's not just social. It's all of them at the same time.
So I pretty much got it outside of my formal training context. So I was active in Worcester Student Movement as a freshman in college. Toward the end of my freshman year, the Army pretty much told me that I was going to go to Mississippi for the Mississippi Freedom Summit. But this was a strategy to deal with the most racist state, which had the highest proportion of African Americans who were basically terrorized out of voting. The strategy was to bring a lot of college students, predominantly white college students, for a summer of intensive voter registration work to sort of expose what happened. And indeed, 2 white civil workers got killed with an African-American Mississippi civil rights worker because we got trained very intensively, including training to be consciously responsible for our racial privilege. And so I sort of learned that I was white in a profound way in the training, and then spent the summer dealing with the complexities of being a white person, asking African Americans to risk their lives, their property, and their livelihoods. And so that was very complicated, because here you have people who are accustomed to accommodating to white people, and here I am, a white person, conscious of that, but also asking them to take these risks. So I had to sort of do a lot of inner work, and we did a lot of work with each other in the multiracial group. I came out of that very conscious of race, conscious of my whiteness, traumatized. Part of what happens when you get together with veterans is that you process some of that in a way that you can't. I mean, if you've worked with combat veterans, it's a similar kind of thing. So I was afraid of white people for a couple of months after it came out. I mean, just in terms of visceral responses. So I was consciously aware that I was white, had white privilege, and that I wasn't in danger, but I still would go on alert around white people, because that was an adaptive thing to do in the situation at Mississippi.
One of the things I used to do, I trained physicians for a long time, and I'd put a bunch of doctors on a bus, and I'd take them to an ethnic neighborhood, and I'd push them off the bus. And then we'd do a variety of activities. Like sometimes I remember one group of docs had 20 docs, and I took them to a Haitian neighborhood, and they had an assignment that they had X number of dollars, and they had to put together a heart-healthy meal from what they could buy within this 3-block section. I knew it was going to make them uncomfortable, because they're going to have to walk into this little Haitian corner store and talk to people who didn't necessarily speak English, didn't speak it very well, were suspicious of people who looked like these docs did. And it was I got a kick out of it, I'll just say. Because when they got back on the bus, they were like, oh my God, that was really hard. I couldn't find anything I even recognized to eat, But they had this experience that 20 years later, they all remember very vividly. And now when they sit with the patient, they have a very different sense of what that patient may be encountering when they're trying to control their hypertension or lose weight or do all the things that doctors so glibly tell us to do. This is the messy part of the work, that if you can get comfortable doing that, doing what I was asking this doctor to do, then you're comfortable getting off the bus someplace else and someplace else and someplace else. And I think it's a huge challenge for academic organizations to really get their students in that messy, sweaty, uncomfortable place where it breaks open their assumptions, it breaks open their emotions, it makes them feel things that they haven't had to feel. It changes them. And that's the hard part. That's really the hard part. But it's also, if you can do it, it's foundational. I think the challenge really is breaking out of the academic box, because it's hard to teach these things if you're not mixing it up. You know, when you're working in communities, it's messy, it's uncomfortable, it's sweaty, it's not pretty work. And when you're sitting in a classroom learning about it, oh, you watch a film and you have a speaker and you share your experiences. It's all kind of hygienic. And I think you learn much more when you get a bit sweaty and you're a bit uncomfortable and you get really challenged. And that's, I think, the real challenge for academic institutions, is to figure out how to provide that kind of experience. Because that's really where you grow. You don't really grow when you're comfortable.
Infusing it everywhere is going to make it a lot less difficult to ignore an issue when somebody says, what does race have to do with this? And somebody who's not the person of color, the woman, the member of the GLBT community, the person from a working class family, et cetera, doesn't have to be the one to bring it up. The ally can as well, because they're going to see it. So this business of mess, I mean, that's what this is. And for us to think that it's a neat thing that you learn in a course, this goes back to the course, that it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Let's put it this way. It's not going to be as effective if it's somehow packaged in a way where people aren't pushed out of their comfort zone. And that's what the mess is.
What brought us to this project is we needed tools to help us where we are. But what kind of came out of thinking about it was that not only do we as individuals need tools and skills, but we wanted to think about how can we start to change the structure or the culture of an organization. How can we affect change in a big picture kind of way?
If there's a buy-in from the top, there is more likely, not always, but more likely, some trickle and some communication, both from an institutional perspective and a cultural, from the way in which the organization can do work. That at least diversity, if not multiculturalism, is valued. When somebody says, I want you to come in and talk to our students, I'd say, well, have you had your staff had any training? If somebody is saying, I want you to come in and work with our staff, I ask about where the leadership has been. If somebody in the leadership has, where's the board in this? So it's really important making it mandatory for the president, all the faculty, the board, every single person to really do this. So then how do they practice thinking? How do they create new courses? How do they change curriculum? How do they make decisions around moving to another location that has this lens in mind?
Faculty has to go out and get sweaty, smelly, awkward, nervous. Because if they're sitting back, sending students, when the students come back, they can't really help them unpack those experiences as effectively as they might. There are ways to think about instead having CEU training for faculty that's out in the community instead of in our four walls, delivered in our safe way. We can, and because I know this can be done because I've done it for years, because I think that really will shift their dialogue and the kinds of dialogue that they'll then be comfortable having with students.
I think that when an organization is more apt to do that and practice it from the top, then it's so much easier for new hires and for folks who are further down in the totem pole to embrace that and believe that is something that the organization believes is important. And if an organization is more used to hiring us for their management level or lower, then it's likely that the addressing of those issues is going to hit a ceiling that maybe to a certain degree at a certain level they'll be able to be talked about, and yet changes may not be made from the institutional level and even the cultural level.
When with Jay Ken and Hugh Camia, we did this consultation with the Red Sox, and this was before they won for the first time in that, and we did a consultation during their spring training and about race and about cultural competency. And when we finished the work, the manager, Tio at that time, talked to everybody and said, baseball says very clear to everybody in the audience, baseball is a racist sport. And just saying that sentence in itself helped to acknowledge and to move towards, okay, so what are we going to do about it? Rather than playing around it and just, not naming it. So you need to name it. And those who need to name it are those who are in a situation of leadership. The higher the leadership saying something, like recognizing and taking responsibility for it, probably the easier it is for me to consult and help people to move forward. It's very hard when you get hired by a bunch of students or the ones to lower the hierarchy, and then there's going to be a lot of anger, maybe some support, but it's going to be very hard to change the organization. And it's long term. I mean, one of the things it's not a workshop, it's not a cultural competency workshop in 2 hours that's going to change an organization. It takes decades to change organizations. I think it doesn't just change from day to night.
When we do our trainings and we're allowed to come back, or we spread the trainings out sometimes, that kind of process can really lead to continuity, to growth in a deeper way. If people are not used to doing this work, if people are not used to seeing things from a certain lens, it takes some practice to actually continue to notice things. And in the repetition comes a deeper way of learning, as well as greater comfort, or perhaps the first step is less discomfort in being able to address or face some of these issues.
So I've done some consulting with BICAP about race in organizations, and really what it has to do with, I think that it makes the most sense to set a tone and then get people in small group conversations that are facilitated so that they can get into unpacking their own internalization of their dominant discourses. The way that I think is most helpful with that, you have your facilitators sit down and have a conversation with each other of how they became aware of themselves racially. So you have that conversation among the leaders in which they're transparent, they set the tone, they get into difficult stuff, they acknowledge things that people don't want to acknowledge because they're uncomfortable. And then you go down into smaller groups and you have the same kind of conversation, and then you bring it back. So you back and forth between the smaller and the larger group. And I think it really has to do with the stance of the facilitators. Are you ready to help to essentially support people to do the uncomfortable exploration? And also you have to be alert to certain kinds of challenges. One challenge is that white people are unaccustomed to the discomfort of addressing race, and that discomfort is a reflection of the comfort of being in a privileged position. So, from my father's heritage, there's the mandate to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Because when I started doing this, it was all about white and black. and it's not about that anymore. And there's a problem of imposing a discourse of black-white that marginalizes Asians, marginalizes Latinos. If it's predominantly white people and African-American people, there's all kinds of conditioning that has African Americans rushing to the rescue of the white people who start going, "Oh, I'm hurting, let's stop everything until I feel better." So you have to sort of be prepared for that and undermine it, subvert it, note it, point it out, and redirect people, and sort of move the idea of supporting each other to a different level than a sort of a pattern where the white people are demanding and expecting comfort from the black people. Okay? So, but if that's your discourse and you have Latinos, Latinas, Asians, if you've got sexual orientation and other differences that are sort of marginalized, you have to be aware that there's a risk of that becoming like the only show. You have to be aware of that and open that up and acknowledge it and invite conversation about that. Usually, unfortunately, you invite it when there's been some kind of microaggression against the sort of the non-black white groups, and sort of bring that forth and talk about it.
What really emerged from the interviews with these expert facilitators was that as much as it's important for us as students to be thinking about these issues and to be well-versed in how to have these conversations, in order to truly change an organization, it's got to be a whole organization effort. And that really starts, from the top of the organization, from the president, from the board of trustees, the faculty, and in sort of a leading by example model. We need to just sort of think about our role as an organization and every level.
Those who are in power have a responsibility to be aware and kind of do the work.
And I think another piece of the role of organizations in this work is to recognize that as an organization we're constantly evolving. So it's sort of like taking a needs assessment, maybe every year or every few years, and saying, this is where we've come from, this is where we are right now. These are the areas that we can continue to grow, and as we expand or as we build these programs, or have more students of color, or socioeconomic diversity, how are we continuing to support them, and how are we continuing to examine ourselves as an organization? Because I think the most important part of this is that there's not just this static, we've done it, but that we can always be doing a better job and just bringing awareness to where are we right now.
Are not just going to be clinicians doing psychotherapy, where this stuff is definitely important, but some of us will be consulting to organizations, some of us will be running organizations, and in those situations, knowing these principles of integrating it everywhere, starting from the top of the hierarchy, are going to be really important to keep in mind.
This next section is us asking our expert interviewers about specific tips and guidelines that they use in their practice, and I think that really came from a place of us feeling like, oh my gosh, I was shut down, or I couldn't have this conversation and I couldn't engage. So what are the tools that I can use?
We have to get people to understand that in this work, you're not safe. You're never safe. You can be safer, but you'll never be safe.
I can only invite you to feel safe, and by my actions and by the relationship that we have. And if you feel safe, that's great. I can't make you there. I can't, make you go there, and I can't make a group go there. I can facilitate a room in a way that has folks willing and maybe able to go a little bit out of their comfort zone and take a risk, because that's really what leads to safety. If I take a risk and you don't shut down, or I don't impact you negatively, or if I take a risk and you see that as an opening for you to take a risk and you do the same, there's a building of trust that starts to take place and the safety kind of grows.
It's going to have hard moments. So I think it's important to normalize the difficulty and to be forgiving of that, and to really prepare ourselves for figure out what are we going to do when that happens. What are the mechanisms to actually repair the injury during the conversation? I think that is very important for everyone to know what are we going to do when someone feels hurt by what someone else did. What are going to be the mechanisms to resolve that? There are ways in which you can structure conversations, like the public conversation project idea, or the reflecting team idea, or many others. Is to think about a structure that everybody knows about. So it's sort of like everybody knows in advance what will happen if this happens, and for everybody to agree that that's going to be the conversation. I don't think that it has to be one kind. That everything has to be done in a certain way, but that everybody agrees that that's going to be the way, and to be explicit about it, and to have someone who can stop the conversation when this is being violated. Second, I think that it's important to figure out a way in which those who tend to be more silent to have more space, and to really set up listening more than talking. I mean, in general, we think about the talking and not the listening. So how are we going to listen? So there's all kinds of ways in which you can structure the conversation for people to be able to listen better, from taking notes, for taking time after they listen to someone, from using a wand to take turns, from having a good facilitator so people are not jumping in, from finding some common ground, for being very explicit about the goal of the conversation. But again, always figure out that it's going to be something is wrong, it's going to happen. I think that the other piece is to really have observers who can make comments about process. So like either processors or reflecting teams or anything that helps people to look at the process outside the content.
First of all, seek formal facilitation training. It's hard to find, I will tell you that. There aren't a lot of places that train facilitation, but if you have that opportunity, find that training, because it will give you some general guidelines of facilitation. In our professional lives, we're taught to lecture, and that's the worst approach for opening up these conversations. Second, find people who are out there doing it and show up at all of their meetings and watch what they do and how they do it. It's a kind of mentoring. When you can really watch somebody, I worked for years with a master facilitator. My God, she was amazing. And I would sit for hours just watching her manage a group. And I learned a lot watching her. The other thing is to start by creating your own spaces. For example, I run a discussion group that's all young psychologists of color, female women. And we talk about all kinds of things. It's a multicultural group, multiracial group, multilingual group. It's a really diverse group. And in that space, which is safer for me, I can get messy and I can be wrong. I don't have to be in the role of expert. So you can start by getting a group of like-minded people together, 2 or 3 or 4 people, and just start meeting monthly and begin to explore together as a small group. I want to talk about race some more. How do we talk about it? And learn from each other, learn together. Because it's not something you can learn as a solo person. You can't sit back and just reflect, because there's nothing pushing your buttons. You have to have stimuli that's pushing your buttons. The other thing I always encourage people to do is practice crossing boundaries. I do it I go to cultural festivals every chance I get. Like I went to this Pakistani wedding. I'm not going to learn a lot about Pakistani people, but I'm going to learn some things about my biases, because something's going to push my buttons. and I'm going to learn something about me. I'm going to have a moment where I'm uncomfortable, and I'm going to learn something. So you're living in an area like Boston that's got this amazing diversity of peoples, and they have all kinds of meetings and festivals and events, cultural, religious events. Go to them. Be the only one in the crowd who looks like you. Be the only one in the hall that comes from your background, and see what that feels like. Experience that. I have a 20-minute rule for myself because I do this. One of my favorite stories, I went to the Chinese businessman's lunch, and it made me nervous just thinking about it. And I just decided, okay, you got to do this. You got to do this. So I go. I walk in the room, and there's about 200 Chinese businessmen, and maybe a sprinkling, there were maybe a dozen women. And it seemed like everybody was wearing a gray suit. I, of course, was not wearing a gray suit. I'm a foot taller than everybody else in the hall. I'm black, and they're not. And they're not speaking English. And I'm like, oh no, what have I gotten myself into? Sweaty, awkward, nervous. Oh, I was very unhappy. My 20-minute rule is whenever I go someplace, I have to stay for 20 minutes. And I do that because the fight or flight reaction is actually time limited. And it goes for about 20 minutes. And then it has a tendency to click off and you relax. And if I make myself stay for 20 minutes, invariably by the end of that 20 minutes, now I'm not so nervous, I'm getting curious. And now I'm looking out again. And I'm kind of wondering what's going on. So here I am at this businessman's lunch. I walk in, I'm awkward, oh God, beyond belief. And I sit down at a random table, and there's these 4 Chinese businessmen. They kind of turn around, they look at me, and they kind of smile, and then they go back to speaking amongst themselves. And I don't know if they were speaking Mandarin or Cantonese. And I'm sitting there going, oh, okay, is it 20 minutes yet? Can I get the hell out of here? And sure enough, after 20 minutes, I started to relax. I started looking around the room. One of the fellows at the table switches to English, introduces himself. I introduce myself. He introduces his colleagues. From that point on, it was an amazing experience. They took me from table to table. They were so excited that I had come, that I had braved the difference, because they do this every day. And that's what happens when you do this. You learn something about you. You learn something. And you meet people that you would never meet ordinarily. I'm still in touch with one of the guys I met at that lunch. He works for one of the big banks, and I see him probably 2 or 3 times a year. We're not friends, but he's now someone that I can learn from when I need to. So one of the things I encourage you to do that takes no money is get a list online, in the newspaper, in the ethnic newspapers, find out where the events are, pick a couple, make yourself go, and you will have to force yourself and make yourself stay 20 minutes. If at the end of 20 minutes you're just too miserable and you can't stand it, leave. But odds are good that by the end of 20 minutes you'll start to get curious. And that's something I do pretty religiously because it keeps me comfortable being uncomfortable. Being curious and being willing to speak out even when I'm uncomfortable, because the curiosity helps me want to learn about why you need an ally, how I might help. If I'm not curious, I won't ask that next question to learn those things. But it's also being willing to speak out, and speaking out is rarely comfortable. It's almost always uncomfortable, especially when you're speaking out on behalf of someone else. They didn't ask you to speak. You don't know if they're going to like the fact that you spoke or not like the fact that you spoke. You just don't know. So there's always this awkwardness and discomfort about being a vocal ally. And again, learning how to tolerate the discomfort and push through it, I find has been critical for me.
So the first principle is to make sure you have allies. The second principle is to make sure you have allies, and the third principle is to make sure you have allies. It's really important. You can't do it solo, and if you're doing it solo, the problem is you're coming out of your own unique set of social locations, and therefore you're missing other things that you can only have by being engaged with people in other social locations. So you have to have your peeps. And if they're in the room, then you get support through the eye contact. And if not, you just sort of, you populate your inner life with them. The next principle is to do your best assessment of the situation, to see how far you can go. And you learn that, of course, from bitter experience and trial and error. But if you try to go too far, you're just going to get dumped on. And you're also going to get tagged as, oh, she's the one that always brings that up, which, takes your voice away. Sort of say, okay, how much do I want to move this? You may just want to acknowledge something without necessarily challenging. Saying, I wonder how this conversation would go if we were paying more attention to the racial difference in the situation we're talking about. And then, who knows, it might be picked up on. Who knows, it might actually, or it may just be said and go. And what you've done is you planted this. And there are various ways that you can sort of plant seeds without making a target of yourself. But you can sort of ask an innocent question, even though it's not asked in all innocence, but you can present it in all innocence. I would bring your truth in and challenge the truth in the conversation and stay in a dialogic mode rather than trying to prove your point mode. Because I think that first of all, you almost always lose. And if you don't lose, you get stereotyped in a way that takes your voice away from the future.
I've always wanted to make sure that we interact in ways where folks can at least notice and talk about the impact that they're feeling in the room without having that be experienced at a personal level for somebody else. So if we're having a conversation and from a gender perspective, I'm dominating the conversation. I'm speaking more. Maybe I finished a sentence or two of yours, and you say, Rick, what? I really feel like you're talking over me, and that, for me, from a gender perspective, I've been quiet too long, and I've been quieted too long, and I would like you to show up differently. Now, I could take that personally, and I could just shut down and just be quiet for the rest of the, or I could learn what is there about my experience of being allowed to speak more, invited, or having my word be valued over women in the staff. What are the many experiences I can tap into that can support your standing up and advocating for yourself? And for me to learn, okay, I'm not a bad guy. I really wanted you to hear my point. I really wanted to help you out by finishing your sentence. So it came out of good intentions. And yet, it's important for me to pay attention to how I've learned to cross over that line, that I've actually felt the privilege to do that. Right? Conversations about behavior, not about essence, is key. So, if you're responding to me, you're responding to me about my behavior, and for me to take it that way. And not for me to take it that you're calling me something of, this is who I am. I think that goes a long way to helping people differentiate from the message, their self from the message, and that I can change my behavior. But if you're talking to me about, this is who I am, oh jeez. I could really go into that space of feeling really down about myself. And so we often invite folks into that kind of a space where there are ways to interact with each other that are actually holding for disagreements are okay, and multiple ways of thinking that are valued and not either or. It's called both and thinking. It's actually very similar. I'm a psychologist by training, so I really experienced this guideline. This is way before I learned the guideline. when I was doing a lot of family work. So when a family of 5 would come in, and I would ask, they would talk about an event that happened this week that was an emotional event for them, for all of them. And I asked them, each of them, to say what they experienced. How many stories do you think I got? 5, right? So who was right?
All of them.
Right, exactly. So from a multicultural lens, and this is also true in systemic family therapy, that each truth is valid, and that it's important for us to build on those, as opposed to the either-or dynamic that we're often invited to, or even demanded to, in this particularly U.S. culture, Western thinking, which is, if I'm right, you're surely wrong, right? Or vice versa. This work is messy. This work is really, can be messy. And, you know, we would argue that if it's not messy, you're not working at it, you're not in the game. And it's also about forgiveness, about forgiving yourself, that we are going to make mistakes. I am going to make mistakes across gender, across class, across sexual orientation, across all the places where I have been historically privileged. Yes, I'm going to notice when I've been dissed from a person of color standpoint. Absolutely. And I have so much privilege in all these other places that it make your head spin. And yet, for me, that core of being brought up African American and living with that had allowed me to not notice all of the privilege that I actually had experienced and continue to, right? So for me to only focus on being a person of color, things will never get messy for me, right? Because I'm not going to make mistakes across gender or class. At least I'm not going to notice them. Let's put it that way. Because my lens will totally be about being an African American man. And for me to really do some, I think, really powerful work, I'm going to have to look at all the places where I have privilege. And I do think that inviting people to understand where they've been able to really walk with the wind, and it's felt effortless, and to imagine what it's like to always, walk into it, and that you're always needing to tack or somehow struggle, that it's always in your face 24/7. Those are the kinds of, just helping people to see what the difference is in terms of what the experience is. I also think that sometimes people can handle accessing the privilege when they've accessed where they've been historically excluded. And that's why I like this model as well, because everybody has privileges on both sides. Privilege on one side and also has felt excluded. And by using that lens, lots of people can kind of breathe and realize that there have been times where it's not all been a cakewalk. There have been times, whether it's as a young person or as a supervisee or as an older person now or as somebody who's temporarily disabled, that there are lots of times where they've actually experienced being seen as or treated as less than. And when they can access that, sometimes when they get into the feelings of talking about that and accessing that, sometimes that can open things up for them to see, okay, well, what about the flip side? Where have I experienced privilege? And what have been some examples? And how has that enhanced my life? How has it made it easier for me? How has it made it difficult? Are there losses with privilege? And there are ways in which we invite people to think that there are benefits and costs to both. I think lots of those different ways of thinking about it personally and also seeing things from a behavioral perspective. There are little strategies, I think, that can help people to not only embrace their privilege, but also embrace the idea that privilege is not a bad thing. It doesn't have to be lost in order for other people to gain some. or to, not to gain some, but be accorded what they should have.
In the spirit of talking about this work, you really have to kind of keep working at it. One thing that we found that came out of our interviews is that it's really a lifelong process, and it doesn't end. And it's something that no matter how experienced you are, you will always have more to learn.
My understanding of cultural competence, which is a problematic term in many ways. Cultural competence assumes that you know what you're doing and you're finished, and that's a problem. I tend to use culturally sensitive or culturally responsive now. Certainly at CMTP, the dominant understanding of cultural competence is that you understand yourself as a cultural being. It's mostly about people sort of examining themselves. You had a multiracial group, and people were examining themselves. And we were certainly talking about client situations, but we were also talking about from the standpoint of, here I am, a black working class worker in this setting, here I am, a white middle class worker in that setting. You know, how does that influence things? I think that if you do that honestly and deeply, that makes you more sensitive and responsive to the clients.
When we do our trainings and we're allowed to come back, or we spread the trainings out sometimes, that kind of process can really lead to continuity, to growth in a deeper way, in terms of being able to do the work and then some confidence in actually doing the work. And that's where a huge amount of this can actually develop some kind of sustainabilities where if people feel confident that they can have a conversation without blowing it up or without worrying about you're going to think ill of me if I make a mistake. We invite people to utilize this model repeatedly, because practice is really, I mean, if people are not used to doing this work, if people are not used to seeing things from a certain lens, it takes some practice to actually continue to notice things. And in the repetition comes a deeper way of learning, as well as greater comfort, or perhaps the first step is less discomfort in being able to address or face some of these issues.
The work never stops. It's not like you reach a certain level of Zen cultural competence moment. It just doesn't happen that way. And that even if you're in a position of, quote, certain level of power, you're going to be facing some of the same issues. Now, you know, you go back to the same issues, but maybe you see them in a different light and you have more tools to actually deal with it.
Because even as many years as I've been doing this, I know that if I stop being uncomfortable, I will lose that facility of managing that. And I can't afford to do that. I have to be able to tolerate that discomfort and roll with it despite it.
I think it was sort of humbling to hear all the people we interviewed talk about this concept of the lifelong process. I know when I was sitting with them, I was just thinking, you know, wow, you know, you know so much, or you've done so much, and that I'm sort of looking up to the people we interviewed and saying, I want to learn more from them, but also hearing them say, I need to constantly be examining myself and constantly pushing myself to grow. These people that we see as experts, part of what makes them experts is that they know they need to keep getting messy and sweaty and involved in this work.
We so want to get it. We so want to reach the point where we feel like, okay, I learned and now I know and now I can go out and do it. And so it was really remarkable to hear that they're still going, and they're still learning, and there's still a lot that they need to learn too. It's exciting to think about that this is something you'll do forever. I know for me, starting this project, I was thinking, I need to learn how to do this. I need to learn, give me the skills, I need to know how to do this. And one thing that I walked away with is this is only the beginning of learning how how to facilitate conversations, how to have difficult conversations, how to help people have them, how to have them myself. I want to now think about what else I can do, how else I can continue this work.
That's sort of the message that we want to send to all of you who are watching this video. You know, we invite you to take this video project and interview more people, or to share this video with people you think it would resonate with. When you're in a situation where something uncomfortable comes up, to have us in your mind, or to have this video in your mind, and to say, am I doing my part in thinking about this a little bit more?
And we just hope for us, for ourselves, for our own growth, and for, you know, everyone else who's watching this, that if nothing else, that we now move forward in thinking about this more consciously in our work that we do, whether it's with clients, families, organizations, between each other, as peers, colleagues, and to be able to recognize if we, you know, the part that we take in all of this.
So we invite you to contact us. We would welcome more allies, groups of people who want to have conversations with us, and who want to continue to engage and do this important work with us and out in the field and in the community in the future.